This is Matthew Moldauer. He and his twin brother were adopted and always thought of themselves as white, although they didn't know much about their extended family. When they were about to apply for university, their father thought that it might be a good idea for them to take a genetic ancestry test. Based on a DNA sample that they sent in, the test broke down their genetic ancestry test into percentages, showing that they were 9% Native American and 11% North African. The twins' father, Alan Moldauer, claimed that these results could be useful for getting financial aid for his sons. And he was interviewed for the New York Times and said, naturally, when you're applying to college, you're looking at how your genetic status might help. I have 3 kids going now, and you can bet that any advantage we can take, we will. Genetic ancestry tests are a rapidly growing industry. About 40 direct-to-consumer testing companies have emerged since the completion of the Human Genome Project in 2003. And together, these companies have sold nearly 3 million tests over the internet. For as little as $100, you can get a test kit like this in the mail. You can send back a DNA sample and get a chart analyzing, for instance, what proportion of your ancestry is European, African, Native American, or Asian. And these categories tend to map onto our concepts of race. Now, for many years, social scientists have been arguing that race is a social construct, that it's not just genetic. So how will taking these tests influence the way that people think about race? Some scholars have speculated that taking these tests will cause more people to think that race is just purely genetic. But some people think that the test could have the opposite effect. If I grew up my whole life thinking that I'm white, and then find out that I have some African ancestry, it's possible that I might question what race really means, or even think that it can't be just genetic if no one knew what my genes showed until now. In fact, in my research, I find that the tests reinforce both views, that race is biological and that race is socially constructed. And people claim that each of these views is backed up with scientific evidence. And that reaction itself shows that the way people interpret scientific evidence is not neutral. Even what's seen as objective facts tend to be interpreted to support the views or answers that we want to find. How do genetic ancestry tests work, and what do they actually tell you? About 99% of the human genetic code is identical in every person on Earth. So these tests are only looking at the remaining 1% or less. In the genetic code, there are specific points where one person might have a G, for instance, somebody else might have a T. And that happens because of random mutation and genetic drift over time. As humans migrated over the Earth in the past 100,000 years, they took these genetic changes with them. So different branches of migration can be identified because of this genetic variation. That means that scientists can use genetics to track how people historically moved around the globe. One type of test focuses on these points in the genetic code to identify the migration routes that a particular line of your family took. Another type of test looks at particular genetic markers that contemporary populations are more likely to have. For example, markers that West Africans are more likely to have than Europeans. But this doesn't mean that no Europeans have those markers. Some do. The tests just provide an estimate or a probability of having different ancestries, not a definitive answer. But even if these tests could tell you definitively and reliably what populations you're descended from, they still wouldn't be able to objectively tell you what your race is. And that's because race is a way of dividing up or categorizing people into groups. It's done on the basis of certain physical or biological characteristics, sure, but people refer to those biological characteristics in deciding what makes up a racial group. Deciding which characteristics matter, whether it's skin color or eye color or height or parentage, that is a social process, and it's something that different societies do differently. This is illustrated by the example of Chiqui Vicioso, a poet born in the Dominican Republic who moved to the United States. And she wrote, Until I came to New York, I didn't know I was Black. Back in the Dominican Republic, her race was considered Indio or Trigueño. These are intermediate categories that are part of a wide continuum of terms that Dominicans use to talk about the different shades, appearances, and mixtures of ancestries. But in New York, in the 1960s, there was no intermediate category, just Black and white. And anybody with any African ancestry was considered Black. Now, if Vicioso had traveled to South Africa at this time, she probably would have been considered colored. This is a different category for people who were a mix of white and Black in any kind of proportion. So the same woman with the same biology falls into different categories according to these norms that different societies have. And what that really shows is that race is not something natural and objective, but how people classify and divide based on what they see and what's important in their particular society. But because genetic ancestry tests present their results in ways that look like race, many scholars are afraid that taking these tests is going to lead people to think that race really is determined by your genes. And we know that this belief can have severely negative consequences. The view that certain groups are essentially or genetically different can quickly morph into the view that they are essentially inferior. And that has been used to justify oppression, forced sterilization, and eugenics, and even genocide. So do these tests encourage viewing races as essential and genetically different? There are some people who take these tests and believe that they show that races exist at a genetic level. I interviewed more than 100 test takers, and I did it in confidence, so these are not their real names. But an example is a woman that I'll call Amy. She is a homemaker with 3 kids. Amy had been adopted, and she only knew that her biological mother was supposedly German. Now, she was ashamed of her German roots because she associated it with the Nazis and the Holocaust, and she was hoping her test might find something else that she could identify with. She was very pleased when she found out that her tests indicated she might have Basque ancestry, and she quickly began to identify as Basque. When I asked her how she defined race, she said, "Well, I think your race, it's just like your DNA. You don't really have much control over it. It's just a scientific fact. You're either white, or you're white and Asian, or whatever you are genetically." Amy viewed race as something that her DNA revealed, and the experience of taking this test reinforced that view. But remember that she also wanted to believe those test results, to know more about her background, and to have something to identify with other than a group that she didn't particularly like. There are other people I interviewed who take a genetic ancestry test and come away with the opposite conclusion, that it can't tell you your race. An example of this is John. He's a sales representative in his 50s. He had always identified as white and Sicilian. And although his test showed that he had Middle Eastern ancestry, he felt that this was irrelevant. What mattered to him was how he'd been raised and the Sicilian culture that he grew up with. When I first interviewed John, he said over and over that race is not a scientifically valid concept. About 2 years later, I interviewed him again and asked him how the testing experience had influenced his view of race. And he said that it had only reinforced what he already believed. He said, "It's probably moved it more in the direction that I've always thought, that science would back up what I believe, that it was more social and economic than biological reasons for differences." Kind of reinforce that with some science. Now, John wanted to continue identifying as white and Sicilian, and found it easy to point toward a view of race that allowed him to disregard the evidence of a different background. And test takers would frequently use words like reinforced, confirmed, or proved to say that these tests just backed up the views they already had. And that was true regardless of what view they started out with. When it comes to how genetic ancestry tests influence the way that people think about race, these tests are like a genetic Rorschach test. Test takers project different understandings of race onto them. Some people believe that they support a view of race as biological. Other people believe that they show that race is socially constructed. And these tests allow the test takers to claim the results that they like or find useful and to disregard the ones that they don't like. So coming back to the example of Matthew Muldaur, maybe this would seem worrying. Will people use these tests to claim benefits that weren't intended for them, like affirmative action or membership in indigenous tribes that have lucrative casinos, or maybe even for even more harmful purposes? I didn't find evidence of people wanting to use genetic ancestry tests to claim benefits or for other purposes. Mostly they wanted to use them for their own identity or understanding of their genealogy. But these tests do open up the possibility of that happening. And those attempts need to be recognized and rejected by universities, tribes, or other organizations. But while these tests don't lead all test takers to believe that race is determined just by their genes, they do reinforce that view for some people. And for this reason, it's important for test takers to understand, and for the testing companies that sell them to clearly emphasize, that your genes may tell you something about your ancestral background, but they can't tell you your race. Thank you.